Every great story has a beginning, a journey filled with passion and a vision for change. Let's take a look at the incredible journey of Nalafem so far. It all started in October 2020 with the organization of 5 regional barazas consultations. These consultations paved the way for the co-creation of the Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto. In November 2020, during the high-level Intergenerational Dialogue, the manifesto was officially presented to the UN Women and the African Union.
Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, and with this submission, I submit the voices, the aspiration, and the hopes and the demands of young women on our beloved continent. And we share now the responsibility and accountability across generations to make sure these demands of Generation Equality Forum are taken into account and acted on.
Over the following months, Nalafem tirelessly worked to gather support. They collected over 10,000 signatures from over 105 countries, both online and offline. Nala Feminist Collective is a Pan-African group of women politicians and activists with a mission to bridge the gap between policy and implementation, intergovernmental and grassroots spaces, as well as generational gap. Their efforts bore fruit when 8 out of the 10 demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto were adopted into the UN Action Coalition's Women, Peace and Security and Humanitarian Action Compact from April to June 2021.
شغل حرية كرامة وطنية. Jobs, freedom, dignity. It has always been a revolution for economic justice led by women and young people.
On July 1st, 2021, Nalafem was officially launched at the Generation Equality Forum in Paris, France. Since then, Nalafem has been leading the way, organizing 6 intergenerational dialogues for accountability in August 2021 and embarking on advocacy missions to several countries. In July 2022, the inaugural Nalafem Summit and Awards took place in Abuja, Nigeria, under the theme, I Am Nala. This landmark event brought together advocates, policymakers, and activists united in the fight against gender-based violence and for gender justice. During the summit, Nalafem also launched their book titled I Am Nala, which shares empowering stories and advocates for the Sustainable Development Goals, the demands of the Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, and African Union Agenda 2063. With the launch of the Nalafem 5-year strategy spanning from 2023 to 2027, Nalafem is committed to advocating for accountability, investing in the socio-economic power of African women and girls, and elevating young African women into politics. To make a difference, Nalafem has devised flagship projects such as the Nalafem Academy, Nalafem Index, Multi-Generational Dialogues for Accountability, Nalafem Fund, and the annual Nalafem Summit. Through these initiatives, Nalafem aims to impact the lives of 1 million women and girls by 2027, nurturing an ecosystem for feminist transformation and amplifying the voices of African women and girls through various mediums, including activism and digital creatives. Also, in November 2022, Nalafem made its mark at COP27 in Egypt. They organized roundtables, supported African climate activists, and led a delegation of 8 young women to the conference. These dedicated activists raised their voices for climate action, advocating for a sustainable future. Alongside these impactful initiatives, Nalafem launched an inspiring podcast series. The I Am Nala podcast amplifies the voices and stories of African women and girls, shedding light on their challenges, triumphs, and aspirations. Nalafem's journey has been marked by collaborations and partnerships with organizations and individuals committed to women's rights and gender equality. We extend our utmost gratitude to our partners for their support. But the journey is far from over. Nalafem invites you to join the cause, to be part of this great vision and mission to liberate the African women and girl. Together, we are all Nala.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Nalafem Accountability Series for our second episode, Data on Accountability, Where is the Money? My name is Sayed Areem Hussain, Project Manager at Nala Feminist Collective, and I will be your host. We hope this series will provide a platform to advance accountability conversations and bridge the gap between policy and implementation, making sure young feminists are at the forefront. As Nalafem, we are guided by Africa Young Women Beijing Plus 25 Manifesto, and our advocacy is focused on supporting member states to implement this manifesto. Take a look. Our apologies for the technical issue. We will play that video when we are able to fix the technical mishap. So to know more, though, you can visit our website, and also to drive this conversation on accountability, let's use the hashtags #NalafemAccountability and #CSW68. For those watching on Zoom, please feel free to share comments and questions in the chat box, as we will take your questions and comments near the end of the webinar. And please remember to keep your microphone on mute while you're not speaking. And please feel free as well to leave your camera on so we can see you, and wave hi to us as you come in. So in this session, we explore and demystify the data on tracking the money committed to gender equality. We will take you through a discussion that unpacks the work of the Generation Equality Forum and the $4 billion committed globally. We will also take a deeper dive and a closer look at the data, the language, and what it means for advocacy. To lead this discussion, I welcome our panelists here with us. We have with us Aminata Kamara, co-lead of the Resourcing Resistance team at Purposeful. Welcome, Aminata. We also have the pleasure to have here with us Maureen Kitonga, who is the Accountability Framework lead at UN Women. Welcome, Maureen, as well as Yvette, who is with us and from the Children's Investment Fund Foundation, and she's the manager and field building lead equity, gender and youth. Thank you, Aminata, Maureen, and Yvette for joining us today and being in conversation with us as we unpack what really is the Generation Equality Forum, what the data is, and I think a big question which drew a lot of people today here in the webinar is, where is the money, and how can we be more involved in the accountability process? So thank you very much for being here with us today. To begin our discussion today, I'd like to hand over to Aminata, who's from Purposeful and who has recently published, I think, a very interesting and impactful report around the Generation Equality Forum. So over to you, Aminata. What is GEF and what money was committed, and what are the findings of the report globally?
Thank you very much for that introduction. Permits me to share my screen and to dive right into the conversation. So at Purposeful, and in collaboration with other colleagues, we wanted to dive into really tracking where is this money based on the commitment that were made to young activists through the GEF process. So I'll just walk you through that presentation briefly. And the report reads, the time is now to redistribute power and resources to girls and young feminist activists. The reason why we undertook this report at Purposeful, we had initially started a grant and a partnership with Plan International and the Irish government, and it gives us insight into the process. There is more information on the Girls Fund in the report, and I know it will be shared in the research report, which will be shared with you later. But also as a coordinator of the With and for Girls Collective, and as members of the collective space, we wanted to undertake this research as collective partners to understand the GEF process and to track where that money is going or what we're learning from that. We also believe that GEF is a platform for mobilizing more and better resources, which most of you will agree with. And this is only a means to an end. And we wanted to analyze what the opportunities were for broader learning and for advocacy. Our approach with this methodology is to really understand, and we undertook a participatory process with girls, with young activists, with funders, with other stakeholders like UN Women, Alliance for Feminist Movements, Global Fund for Women, Girls, Young Feminist Activists, also wrote case studies, and one of them being Nalafem. From that process also, when we dived into the power analysis, we wanted to understand where and how power manifests in the process, and not just in terms of money, but also where decisions were made, who determined timeline, and so on. Data gaps and challenges, we're working with the data online. So the data that were available to us to analyze were data available online, which was basically the list of financial commitments. We also undertook focus group discussions, interviews. We had workshops to really engage young activists on the GEF process and their reflections so far. One issue that stood out was the duplication or double counting, and I'll dive into the data very soon in the next slide, but just to highlight, one of the issues that we realized was double counting for the money. So for example, INGOs or bilateral funders will say they've funded, let's say 2 young activists, but actually the money they've sent out went to intermediaries or INGOs and NGOs who are mostly led by young people sometimes, but also established organizations who are either reaching girls or centering girls and young feminists. The relevant insight that we've identified through this report and this process was that young feminists have long been impacted by philanthropic struggle to move resources at the sort of speed and scale to autonomous girl and youth-led organizing. But yet still, there is an inability of any of the major players within the GEF process to sustainably resource girls and youth co-ownership and leadership. And this is really striking and one of the challenges that pervade also are the undeniable rooted of this process in patriarchy and in colonialism. Because when it came to really moving resources at the pace and the speed that young activists wanted, it wasn't just realizing. But also not only resources to facilitate meaningful co-ownership and leadership, but we also realized that when the resources were actually available, the infrastructure and the operational realities of the donor system has also created stumbling block for young activists to access these monies. It is also clear that there are confusion that persists between the funding youth-led and funding youth-serving groups and organizations. And while many funders believe they are funding youth organizing, like I initially mentioned, these monies are actually going to NGOs and INGOs led by adults that are not truly youth-centered in any way. The money, even when available also, are committed to young people, has simply not reached them. The report reveals again that there is a lack of the most basic of resources. An example of that being, for example, data for young activists to access online platforms like this convening that we're having right now, airtime, travel expenses to attend CSW, where there are actually decision-making power conversations happening. They're mostly shut out of these platforms and these spaces to influence and to even add their voices to the conversation. Another discovery is that funders lack dedicated girl and youth strategies to differentiate funding to youth-led initiative in their grant-making processes and in their programs. In terms of GEF, there's a co-ownership. There's a struggle with co-ownership and accountability. There's a power and decision-making remains at the global level and mostly that are excluding young people because of all the barriers that I've initially mentioned. there is limited or no funding to support young people to meaningfully engage in regional and also global advocacy accountability processes. Young activists who have designed and led across the value chain of GEF mentioned throughout the consultative meetings that they are tired, that they are delusioned, that there is a collective sense that their love and labor, their deep expertise and strategic vision has not been sufficiently valued. It has been taken for granted. They also mentioned that at the design, setting up and sustaining GEF has become an industry in and of itself. And I know most of us have an insight into that. The sheer scale of intellectual and human resource committed to the process has at most times obscured what should be core political purpose for GEF. This is a resource-sustaining intersectional movement driving gender justice effort to transform unequal policies and laws. And we continue to see this gap rhetorically and also across resource distribution. So despite facing the challenges, funders are also open to learning, to do things differently. That is one thing we realized. Funding non-financial accompaniment in the process was also identified as a priorities by girls and young feminists. So one of them being like travel grants for them to access these convenings and platforms. Feminist intermediaries and fiscal sponsors are critical in moving these resources. So utilize those opportunities more. And there is some potential to influence remaining philanthropy and bilateral stakeholders involved in the GEF process. And as you know, there's an interest from young people as well and allies for intergenerational and collaborative advocacy. Young activists are seeing GEF as a platform for more sustainable funding for their movement. So we have a few recommendations as we move into CSW, also continue engaging. And one of them that came from the report is, it is not too late to move better resources to girls and young activists through the GEF process, and how we move these resources are as important as how much money we move, the opportunities to break down those colonial power structures across moving those resources. Another recommendation also is investing in testing participatory processes with girls and young feminists. Let them be involved in this resource distribution so they know exactly that the money is moving and where it's moving. There is also a recommendation to work with feminist intermediaries and track data of what funding is reaching girls and youth-led groups. What is needed is a reflection on the ecosystem. We need space for a more nuanced discussion of how and what is our role, our individual role in the GEF process. This does not always need to be moving resources directly, but it can look different based on your context and your interests and politics as well. For those involved in GEF, this is a moment to leverage the GEF stakeholders, be in conversation with girls and young feminists about what's best support you can provide for them. So from this report also, we've come up with a recommendation for girls and young activists, one of them being check out the advocacy tool, which will be shared in the chat, of how to advocate for more and better resources, and also to review the mapping of stakeholders. It also includes tips for campaigning and advocacy. And the report also will be shared for you to really dive into the recommendations and the testaments that are coming from young activists. There is also a communication tool which you can engage with. Kindly use it as it applies to your context or that best serve your purpose. It has conversation on peer learning with funders. There are also key messages to use to inform talking points, like if you want to use it in conversations and meetings. So I'll hand over to my co-presenters to just walk us through. Thank you very much, and I'll be here for questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Aminata. And I think, that's, a really important question that you raised near the end, which is, that we need to, especially as young feminist organizations, identify what our role is in the GEF process. And I think on that note, I'd like to move the conversation to you, Maureen. And Maureen, is here just as a reminder to our viewers, is here from UN Women. We've reached the midpoint of GEF. what does the accountability framework look like? If you could, just demystify that for a lot of the feminist organizations in the room. And moving forward, how can we best, as young feminist organizations, engage in this accountability process?
Thank you very much. And as rightly asked, I'll be speaking to the accountability process. I'll provide an overview and provided a bit of additional insights that will be beneficial to the participants in this meeting. And so the generation equality is a sustained journey that must be underscored by accountability, transparency, and delivery. The Action Coalition Monitoring and Accountability Framework, co-designed with Action Coalition leaders and commitment makers, outlines the path of driving collective accountability by monitoring progress and challenges in implementation, advocating for improved reporting and further action, and being accountable for the action taken. The framework is a bold promise of action, coalition stakeholders to foster a culture of transparency that improves the probability of achieving transformative impact set out in the Global Acceleration Plan. So as you can see on this slide, the framework is made up of 4 key elements: measuring progress against commitments towards achieving blueprint targets, documenting and transformative processes, and stories of impact. So commitment makers are obligated to report annually on the progress of the commitment's implementation. And the following slides will, delve into it a bit more. So UN Women essentially leads the assessment of blueprint targets. This is a set of targets and indicators that describe the broader ambition of each action coalition. This year, this assessment was released for the first time. As you've also heard, the numbers only tell half of the story, which is where the success of the framework also relies on the documentation of stories of progress and impact to foster learning. So in the following slides, I'll present a brief overview of the findings of this year's survey with emphasis on the financial commitments and analysis. UN Women produces a report every year, as you've already had, to take stock of the progress, and my colleague will also paste here the link of this year's report in the chat. Next. So, getting into the accountability framework for 2023, as we said, reporting is crucial to accountability, and this year the response rate on commitments has more than doubled compared to last year's, with an increase from 31% to 69%. And for us, this is a demonstration of continued commitment amidst the challenges. Of these reported commitments, 54% are being implemented in Sub-Saharan Africa and 35% in Northern Africa and Western Asia. 21% of commitments originate in Sub-Saharan Africa and 5% in Northern Africa and Western Asia. Next slide. So in terms of the key findings, among the key findings of the report is that generation equality multi-stakeholder model of solidarity and collaboration is working. As you can see, 82% of reported commitments are being implemented through new and strengthened partnerships, and 83% of commitments reportedly integrate an intersectional lens, while 89% support marginalized groups or communities. And so generation equality is increasingly influencing national and local changes, with some examples mentioned here. As you can see on the right, we have highlighted examples of how generation equality is being localized in Burkina Faso, in Kazakhstan, Kenya, and the United Republic of Tanzania. So essentially for us, further details of this can be found in the report. In this slide, I'm going to provide a bit more, findings with a bit of a financial lens. And so commitment makers have made commitments that are financial, programmatic, policy, or advocacy in nature. The financial data reported shows promising signs of progress, with stakeholders mobilizing funding for gender equality, yet reported financial data has gaps. Of the 47 billion reportedly pledged in financial commitments, 20 billion is secured, 49.5 billion is spent across the world. So zooming in on the African continent, about 10 billion are pledged to be invested solely in sub-Saharan Africa, and 32 billion pledged for more than one region, but including sub-Saharan Africa. Looking at Northern Africa and Western Asia, no financial pledge are recorded solely for this region, but about 17 billion are pledged in more than one region, including North Africa and Western Asia. If you look at the slide again, you also see globally, youth-led organizations, I think, just have about 6 billion that are, sort of financial commitments that are allocated to them, which is not much really. And so, additionally, 146 policies are reportedly being implemented, along with 516. As you can see, in sub-Saharan Africa, 128 policies are reported being implemented, along with 403 programs and 1,209 advocacy initiatives. Next. So the data suggests promising evidence of progress, but still shows that we can do better. Some issues require our collective attention, particularly strengthening youth engagement. As you've heard from Aminata, there is still a call for meaningful youth engagement, and this also, we can see this from the data. And so making reporting of financial commitments more transparent, and also building geographical diversity to fill in gender gaps. More than half of commitment makers who reported on financial commitments elected not to disclose secured, amounts secured or spent, and this undermines our ability to monitor progress. And as you can see also, only 10% of secured financial commitments are reportedly invested in civil society, adolescent girls, youth and youth-led organizations. And so we estimate a high number of unreported cases, and thus require better reporting mechanisms. And of course, in total, the overwhelming majority of committed funds originate from Europe and North America, which is around 92%. You can also see, on the extreme right, that youth are still they're still highly engaged and want to stay engaged, and but young leaders say that they're seldom included on an equal footing, and other stakeholders that they find it a tokenistic practice and remain common. And so youth continue to face constraints, both financial and human, and of course work overload and burnout. This is some of the issues that came out in the report, and really it's just re-emphasizing what Aminata already mentioned earlier. And so in terms of what's next for us, we are going to be first developing a new measure for, developing new measures for improved reporting. And so here we want to establish systemic means of tracking financial commitments in organization-wide budgets, including revised tools, methodology to monitor all allocations and expenditure, transparency of new and old investments, and to close the data gaps, really, especially for those that are secured and spent towards civil society organizations, youth and adolescent girls. The second thing for us is to enhance capacities for meaningful engagement. So, allocate unconditional, flexible funding and technical resources to defray the cost of commitment, implementation, and meaningful participation of young people in generation equality. And then, of course, stock taking and learning, it's a continuous process. And so we plan to organize accountability learning sessions with interested commitment makers to get feedback and ideas for future improvements. And that's why this meeting was also very important for us, because we see it as, continuous engagement in this discussion. Thank you very much. And, for any of you that want to get the report, it's online, it's on, but Svenja has also posted it in the chat. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Maureen. And for ending with that, that one point of the way forward as being these accountability learning sessions. I think that's like one way that we can definitely, as young feminist organizations, become more ingrained and into how we track where the commitments are and the progress that we're making around the Generation Equality Forums. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to turn the next question to you, Yvette. As SIF, a philanthropic organization, and as funders that support youth-led and CSO-led accountability efforts for GEF globally and in Africa, what do you see your specific role is as this, I think very specific kind of funder? And also in your engagement, if you could also, touch on from your engagement with these youth-led organizations and CSOs and different partners, what are the gaps and opportunities that you're really seeing coming out around the work that they're doing on accountability?
Thank you so much, and thank you for having us here for these critical debates and conversations around accountability for GEF, but most specifically looking at how we can promote youth and civil society-led accountability. So let me start with a quick intro to how we work at CIF, which is a Children's Investment Fund Foundation. As a children and youth-focused funder, we place particular importance on supporting children and youth, not just as recipients of programs, but as agents of change. And we do this by investing in programs that enhance the leadership capacity of our youth, supporting youth-led advocacy and accountability, and youth-led coalition and movement building. So given CIF's commitment to gender transformation, this actually translates to specific investments and partnership with young feminist leaders. So how do we use that information and background and then loop into the Generation Equality Forum and its processes? So as we all know, Generation Equality Forum provides us a powerful vision of what inclusive multilateralism should look like and what it can look like. But importantly, it commits to putting its agenda setting process in the hands of civil society, and particularly youth as the generation that is most affected by the inequalities we witness today. CIF is currently co-leading the Bodily Autonomy and SRHR Action Coalition, and we are also a commitment maker to the Economic and Justice and Rights Action Coalition. So we see generation equality as a critical process and platform to drive progress towards the SDGs, particularly SDG 5 that centers on gender equality. And we do this by empowering civil society and youth leaders to hold governments and others to account for delivery of their policy and programmatic commitments, because we believe that this is absolutely critical to ensure that real progress is made, essentially moving us from the perspective of rhetoric and talk to actually walking the talk in terms of implementation and action. How do we see this then streamlined or implemented in Africa? Civil society and youth leaders have engaged in evidence-based advocacy for years to drive African government commitments, and we are seeing this increasingly towards GEF over the last 3 years. We've proudly supported Nalafem and other African-led partners in these efforts. And in Kenya, we are looking at this from the perspective of CSOs and youth driving advocacy and accountability, which is being led by FemNet, Equality Now, and other partners, and was instrumental in securing Kenya's Generation Equality Forum commitment, particularly to end gender-based violence. So what does this mean for philanthropy such as CIF? We advocate for this in 3 parts. One is to resource youth-led civil society actions to enlighten advocacy and accountability, leading to greater impact. And we believe that we could do this through investing in the monitoring and reporting capacities of youth-led organizations, so that 1, they're able to collect the data, but also 2, analyze this data and information to highlight where progress has been made, to address the challenges that have been highlighted, because we do know that there are some, and these have been presented by Aminata and Maureen, who spoke before me. We also advocate at a global level for the GEF reporting processes to be made simpler and clearer, because they have been complicated, which has made more time-intensive efforts for already under-resourced organizations to participate in the reporting process. Secondly, we advocate for more funding towards youth organizations, and we use evidence both within and outside of philanthropic institutions to make this case, because we believe more funding towards youth and feminist movements will be able to lead to actual change for the most underserved in our communities. And lastly, when it comes to the role of philanthropy, it's really looking at how do we evolve our own grant-making practices. So it's been said before, it's not just about the resources, but how those resources are acquired and how they're utilized and disseminated. So in terms of having an inward-looking approach to our role as philanthropy, revising our grant-making models so that they're more participatory, looking at how we support language justice, given that the fact that this has to disseminate across to the different communities. So those would be our three really call for action for philanthropy. And then moving forward to the question you asked, what are some of the gaps? What are some of the opportunities that we've seen? So Aminata and Maureen have articulately presented the challenges. If you're looking at the gaps in resourcing, the UN Women Accountability Report has flagged that only 12 million of secured funding is dedicated towards youth-led organizations. Aminata shared the report from Purposeful and With and for Girls that really says youth-led feminist groups remain under-resourced and excluded from meaningful ownership of the formal GEF accountability mechanisms. And this is really a call to action for all of us. In Africa specifically, FemNet has published an in-depth analysis of African governments' commitments, private sector and private philanthropy alike. And it really outlines the stark gaps in resourcing for local women's rights organizations and feminist civil society, but also too, the challenges in having responses from our African governments in terms of their reporting to this process as compared to global North governments. We're also funding and happy to fund a program partner, Global Fund for Women, which has come up with the Feminist Accountability Framework. And the first report was launched at ANGA that was done together with 25 other feminist groups. And here they have recommendations for some of these shortfalls that we've mentioned. If we start with looking at flexible and long-term funding, is critical, especially for grassroots groups to achieve the Generation Equality Forum agenda. Secondly, this funding needs to be prioritized to smaller, locally led and grassroots action, as opposed to the intermediaries. I'm not saying that the intermediaries are not important, they're critical for the ecosystem, but how do we also channel some of this funding towards the community level? And then thirdly, community makers at all levels communicating through the language justice we've highlighted, engaging with communities at all levels in making decisions about how to distribute this funds. So it's a co-led, but also co-owned agenda driven by the needs of the community. And lastly would be that the GEF and international government system must do more to hold themselves accountable. So it's really also looking inwards as we are doing in philanthropy to see how we can also be accountable to this process, leading to mutual accountability and attainment of our goals. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Yvette, for that. And I think that leads, to a really important point, and what the purpose is for this specific episode of this accountability series was just looking at the importance of language, methodology, process, and structure when we are developing or creating a framework for accountability. And on that note, I hear, you, Yvette, speaking about CIF's involvement with the Feminist Accountability Framework. Aminata as well has spoken, to this, and Maureen as well, with, how data is collected and how do we partner as being very intrinsic to the different accountability processes that are going on around the Generation Equality Forum. And I think on that note, I'd like to direct this question maybe first to Yvette, and then Maureen, and then Aminata, you can come in as well. what innovations or concrete examples or case studies can you share from either your country, your region, or your organization that you feel is effective on accountability, whether on gender or other sectors, that we can learn from to apply on gender? And this, this specific question, so that we can innovate more. I think in terms of how we collect this data, how we use those stories. I hear, Maureen speaking about the stories of impact in the accountability framework of UN Women. But how do we really innovate when we're talking about the data and make the data more impactful to governments, but also, to communities, CSOs, and other commitment makers?
Thanks. I would say, and I talked about it earlier, is the feminist accountability framework being one of the best practices that we're seeing when it comes to accountability is really looking at the different sectors that need to be involved as one, starting from a perspective of getting the voices of the most underserved in our communities. So Global Fund for Women initially consolidated groups globally. So we are working with 25, or they're working with 25 organizations across the world, and coming from a perspective of first listening to the needs that have been highlighted from the youth-led organizations as priority and as key for them. We've also seen groups in West Africa innovating through use of materials. So in West Africa, fabric is very critical in passing messaging. And they've been able to use this to communicate and raise awareness, because the one thing that we need to be aware of when it comes to accountability processes is that we also need to enhance community awareness of what's happening at the global level, and use of arts, culture, and other innovative mechanisms by the youth is critical to then raise this awareness. And secondly, after those needs, priorities, and voices have been captured, is how do we translate that to the commitment makers, to our governments, to private sector, philanthropy, and otherwise, and groups such as Global Fund through the Feminist Accountability Forum, Nalafem through the Young Feminist Manifesto, different ways within which we can capture this through policy briefs, through conversations such as this. I mentioned arts, music, spoken word, poetry. These are very critical in terms of how we are able to pursue this agenda, but also really advocating for Nalafem and other youth-led organizations to really look at it in three-pronged ways. One is to organize by continuously building bridges with other youth-led organizations and networks. Second is to connect with funders who are aligned, such as ourselves, to continue building the case for investments in youth-led accountability work. And then lastly, to advocate with their governments and other partners for more and better resourcing of civil society and youth-led organizations. And I just want to call to mind here something that is important, is as we are continuously advocating, is looking for ways to localize GEF. So I've talked about use of materials as arts and culture, but also looking at how do we work with UN Women, for example, so that this reporting is linked to existing protocols, existing reporting such as for the Maputo Protocol, which will help reduce the burden on reporting and also break down the silos that have been created when it comes to regional and global reporting on gender equality. Thanks.
Thank you so much. So I had the same question to Aminata.
Yeah, I think one innovation that we've seen worked is really decolonizing aid and the NGOization of the GEF resources and commitments. We've seen where we've led and managed a participatory process to the GEF resources, and where young activists are really quite accountable to each other, and they come up with accountability mechanism to each other in our grant making processes. So they decide where resources go and how they account to each other, and not just to like a donor and grantee dynamics, but that they are actually owning this process. They are also very involved in where these resources are going, how they're spent. So it's just trusting their leadership and decolonizing the GEF process for young activists. That would be that is what I have seen work in my context.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So over to you, Maureen, same question. And I think maybe, as UN Women, if you could just touch a bit more on, I think very like an innovative part of the accountability framework, which already exists, is the use of stories of impact. So maybe if you could unpack that a bit more for us on how those stories are actually used in the data. And how we can also innovate around those stories and how we can use them, in our advocacy to really push to ensure that these commitments are fulfilled.
Thank you. And as I said earlier, there's a lot in the report. It was just amazing to see what different commitment makers have done across different action coalitions. I must say it was quite impressive reading some of these stories. And one of the things that we also did differently this year was that we have some 6 case studies that we should be sort of disseminating by end of November, that really unpack these issues a bit further. And so the 6 case studies are around policy commitments, collective commitments, the generational equality principles, localization, financial commitments, but more importantly on youth and adolescent girls. What these case studies do is really just to interrogate further, who are the players, what's working, what's not working. And, it was, it's very interesting to hear from different commitment makers. We had commitment makers that came from different regions, from different action coalitions, but also, the different types of commitment makers, member states, youth organizations, and feminist, organizations. And so these case studies will really be able to showcase what's working and just what's not working. And we are hoping that from these lessons, then we are able to, have a better understanding of what we might be underestimating or overestimating as we get into the second half of generation equality. So we hope that to continue working together, especially once these case studies are out, just to make sure that everybody is aware of them, but also what kind of lessons have come out of this case studies.
Thank you so much, Maureen. So we have, quite a number of people here today. I'd like to, pass it on if anybody has any questions. You can do it in 2 ways. You can either raise your hand and we will hand over the mic to you, or you can share your question or comment in the chat box. So if there are any questions for the speakers, you may raise your hands. Nancy, I see you're on mute. Do you have a question? Hi, Nancy.
Sorry, no question. Thanks.
Okay, no problem. Hello and welcome, Dr. Nyarazai. It's so great to see you and have you today here on the webinar. I'll hand over the mic to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm here to first extend my congratulations to the Nala Feminist Collective for growing in strides and creating space for crucial conversations. Unless we have the discussions like you are having today, we won't have a gender transformative a world that we are looking at. My name is Dr. Nyarazai Gumbondrand. I'm with Rosaria Memorial Trust. I support the young feminist movement, including in my community. I think the critical, the 2 points that I wanted to check and with the panelists is how how can we recognize and how can funders and partners recognize and resource more young African professionals? Because the narrative usually is of the poor African girls. Definitely we have girls struggling, child marriage, out of school, but we also have amazing young professionals like many of you in this room. So at times in the world of research, I'm involved in a number of research areas with universities. Young professionals, young African women professionals are mostly seen as research assistants, community data collectors, and not as core researchers. So how can we reposition the world of work to also recognize that African young women with their experiences are also professionals and experts, in addition, of course, to the other issues that I have raised? The second question that I have is how can we build a feminist philanthropy approach that that builds collaboration with community-rooted organizations that are also doing philanthropy, but a different kind of philanthropy where we are also resourcing with what we have in the communities. So the kind of collaborations from a philanthropy, a feminist philanthropy point of view, is part of demanding accountability with community-rooted groups is important. And thanks so much, Yvette, for your presentation. I came in when we were in the middle of the presentations. Thank you, and over.
Thank you, Dr. Nyaradzi. I think I'd hand over maybe that last question to you, Yvette, on philanthropy. And maybe the question on how do we decolonize the way we're looking at, and if we're saying now the accountability process as data collectors, really looking at I think the question is, who are the actual data collectors, and how do we decolonize, reclaim and reposition African young women as professionals within the methodology and the structure of how we are conducting data collection around accountability. And maybe I'll direct that question to both Aminata and Maureen. So we can start with Yvette, and then we can go to Maureen and Aminata. Over to you, Yvette.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Dr. Nyaradzi, for the question, and it's lovely to have you join us. It's interesting that you would ask that question because I'm currently seated at the UAF Africa offices, and one of the conversations that we are having today is actually Pan-African and Feminist Philanthropies Initiative. How do we connect these two? So when we have conversations around African philanthropy on one end, and then we have conversations around feminism on the other, is really looking at an initiative that brings these two issues together. And one of the things that is actually being discussed is the narratives around philanthropy and feminisms in Africa, so that we are able actually to own the agenda in terms of identifying the narrative, so that it is not only as seeing Africans, as you've mentioned, as those in need, but also those contributing to a lot of the work and development that's happening in Africa. So a lot of research has gone into looking at the fact that the work that is being done by the diaspora, the community philanthropy, is actually raising more resources than the aid that we receive from development global north countries. So how do we then change the narrative so that Africa's giving is seen as not that only focuses on the small initiatives in terms of education and others, but that can drive the agenda at the global level, and even look at how do we even restructure the international financial architecture to be able to really give spaces for African feminists and philanthropy to grow. So I'm really excited about this initiative, and we look forward to sharing more. But the perspective coming from traditional philanthropy or data-driven philanthropy is also looking at conversations around shifting power and decolonizing philanthropy to see how we can embed more the voices of, younger women, those that have professionals that we also want to advance and advocate for. So really exciting conversations and looking forward to sharing.
Thank you so much for that, Yvette. So over to you, Maureen.
Thank you, Dr. Nyarazai. It was heartwarming to just see you on this call. You wouldn't know, but you actually hired me when I started my career. So thanks to you. Just to respond on the young women professionals, I think for us, coming from a data perspective, is first, unpacking who are the youth. I must say that when we're reporting, we just say youth and just sort of lump everyone together, the young men, the young women, and not really disaggregating who are these youth across the region, because of course contexts are also different. So I think further disaggregation of this data, of youth data, to really be able to tell the story in a more accurate manner. And then also, as you heard in the accountability framework, we also look at the different programs, policy, in terms of commitment makers investments. We look at investments in policy, in programs, and also in advocacy. I think one other way that we could perhaps is interrogate the type of programs that exist. What programs are really focusing, for instance, on young women professionals, and and also going further to research organizations. I must say that actually research organizations are amongst the least reporting commitment makers, amongst the different commitment makers type of organizations that we have. And so perhaps again, interrogating further out of these research commitment makers, how many are really working with young African women, but also amongst the programs that are being reported by different commitment makers across the globe, which of these are targeting young African, women. I think, this is a challenge to us, and we really should be able to look into it in the next reporting cycle. And again, as Dr. Nyarazai said, I must commend initiatives such as Nalafem. Continuous support of such initiatives and collective initiatives, I think, is something that we would, of course, encourage and continue highlighting and telling the story of how impactful they are. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. So over to you, Aminata, having published this, I think, very impactful report and even inspiring data collection method. How can we best, decolonize and reclaim these spaces for young women professionals in the accountability process?
I think most of the recommendations stood out in the report, and I'll really encourage people to engage with that report. One of them being having the resources from the GEF process, not just directed to programs and grants, but that they're actually flexible and young activists can decide what to allocate those resources to. Another thing also that stood out from the report is access to platforms like this platform which Nalafem is organizing, access to CSW and other decision-making and power engaging platforms. How do we ensure that the resources that are there are not only directed to programmatic purposes, but they are actually flexible for young people to decide what needs attention and financing as against what the mandates of the broad philanthropic and bilateral agendas are. I think that is something, and our role really is to continually engage with stakeholders in the GEF process to see how we decolonize aid, how do we spread out the finances that are available, because as the data shows in this report, most of the money can't be tracked, they're lost, or they're not going to the right hands that they're meant to be in. So how do we continually engage with the resources that are currently available to ensure that they're reaching young activists. They are going directly into the hands of girls and young activists who will allocate them into the needs that they have. So these are our agendas and what we'll be working with continually, because as the report said, young people are tired. They're tired of giving these recommendations without really seeing tangible action. So now it's time for action, and now it's time for collaboration across the board.
Thank you so much, Aminata. So as we begin to close this conversation, and I know we can, it can go on for longer, and there's so much to unpack. I'd just like to invite our panelists to complete this sentence for me. I am Nala because, over to you, Aminata.
I am Nala because I am fierce and courageous.
I love that. I am Nala because, Yvette?
I am Nala because I believe in transforming philanthropy to meet the needs of African women and girls.
Thank you very much. I am Nala because, Maureen?
I am Nala because improving the quality of women and girls will transform the world.
Thank you so much, and thank you very much to our great panel for sharing such valuable insights and resources. We will share them in the chat for everybody to access. And thank you everybody for signing in and taking the time to sit us for this hour to really delve into what the data is and how we can innovate around accountability and the accountability framework. Thank you for joining us. We hope that our discussion today has contributed to promoting the importance of accountability. Please join us in our next webinar on November 3rd. Our topic will be, and I hope this is a very exciting one, decolonizing funding for accountability. Feel free to reach out to us on email at facilitator@nalafem.org to suggest speakers you would like us to invite for the next webinar, or simply to share your feedback. Again, follow us on social media and continue to use the hashtags #NalafemAccountability and CSW68. We will meet every Friday, first Friday of the month, and can't wait to see you all next month. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great week and weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.